Tell me about your first bought and dress.
Well, the first bought dress that I can remember was given to me by uh, what we call Tanya Hilke, which would be Hilda today. That was my dad's oldest sister. And she kind of favored me for some reason or other. Probably felt sorry for me, although I didn't feel sorry for myself because I had polio. But she never gave any of the other kids any birthday presents. But she gave me this beautiful pongee dress. I can still see it. And they called them bloomer dresses in those days. And it had pants that were below your knee, and then the dress, and they called them bloomer dresses. And that was the first store-bought dress that I had. Everything else was always uh, made, you know.
And how old were you?
I must have maybe been about 4 or 5 years old when she gave me that, and somewhere I do have a picture of that, standing by the lilac bush with my bloomer dress on.
Mm. What about chicken soup? Is there a special story about chicken soup?
Oh, there is a special story about chicken soup. My father had a wonderful sister, Kate, Aunt Katie. Tana Trincha, we called her in Dutch. And they would come out to the farm, and they had their son, Billy, who was into everything, and a girl, Nellene, 3 days younger than I. And one day, my mom and them were all in the house having tea, and they thought, my, it's awfully quiet. I wonder what those kids are into now. So here they came, Billy and Elaine and I. Well, my dad had little chicks in this one chicken coop. We had 2 chicken coops, one where the laying hens were and one where the baby hens were, and then he had a certain incubator type thing that kept them warm, and in the corner was a crock of water. So Billy decided that we ought to make chicken soup. So we took some of these little baby chicks, which were precious, I mean, because money was so scarce, and we took these chickens and put them in that water, and I had a stick, and I'm stirring and stirring and stirring, and here came my mom and Dad and Uncle Bill and Aunt Katie, and they says, "What are you doing?" I says, "I'm making chicky soup." And with that, they didn't spank me or anything, but they quick took the chickens out of the water, brought them into the basement where we had a kerosene stove, and they lit the burners, and they put these poor little chickens around there, hoping to revive them. A couple of them made it, but the rest of them died. But I heard about that for the rest of my life. I never lived that down, that I made chicky soup out of live little baby chicks, which was a waste of... We had fun.
You didn't know. Isn't there some story about Grandpa falling down the steps?
Oh, that was when I was a teenager, and on Sunday afternoon, my dad always took quite a long nap upstairs because he had such short nights going to the market. He would get up at 1 o'clock in the morning, and then he'd come home, maybe 9, and go directly into the field and work. And then we would have dinner at 12 on the dot, and then he would lay down for an hour, go back in, and work again. And then in the evening he went to bed early, but he really didn't get much sleep. So he had to kind of catch up on Sundays. So this one day, Sunday, he was getting up, and we heard some noise. So my mother thought, hey, I wonder what happened to Pa. So we had a pantry that had a door, which was right opposite the door that went upstairs. So my mother, thinking she was going to help my dad so he wouldn't bump into the door, she opens up the door, and my dad went sliding right through, down the steps, into the pantry, and he was so angry. He said, "Why in the world did you open that door?" He says, "I was thinking, boy, the door will stop me." And instead, I went zooming right through, and we all kind of laughed, but he was very unhappy. But fortunately, he didn't break any bones or anything, but it really could have been serious. But we laugh about that many, many times, even to this day when I tell it to people. And later on in life, why he would laugh at it too. And he says, "Why, Ma, ever open that door?" I don't know. He says, halfway down, I'm thinking, well, at least I'm going to get that door to stop. And he went sliding right through.
What kind of a parent was he?
He was really a wonderful father. He was stern and strict, but not mean. Not mean. And he, like when I would be studying catechism or something and I didn't know the answer, well then I would ask them, and between the two of them, then they would discuss it in Dutch because they knew the answer in Dutch, but they were trying to figure out how to tell me. Then my dad could tell me in English what it was, and he was really quite a tease in a way if you really knew him, because when Martha was dating Jack, then he would egg me on, say to Martha, "Little choocha, teach you," or something like that it was, and that meant kiss. And it would make Martha so angry, and my dad would just egg me on, and he'd tell me something else to say in Dutch, so I'd say that to Martha, you know. And so he was really kind of a tease, and he liked to have fun. And then the three little boys, we always called them, the boys are John, George, and Wes that were younger, and my dad played cards, rook. We weren't allowed to have pinochle in the house, pinochle cards, because that was the devil in those cards. But they played rook, which was basically the same thing, except they thought it was okay. But almost every night they played a game of rook around the kitchen table before they went to bed. Even after we were married, Don remarks about how they weren't allowed to play pinochle, but they could play rook. And he was really, I would say, a kind father.
What was it like around the table?
Around the table, there was silence. There were so many of us that my father would sit at the head, and back along the window side was a bench for all the little ones to sit, and the rest sat around. And if anyone did anything or talked too much, all my dad had to do was look at us and wiggle his little heavy eyebrows, and we knew behave. But it was really quite well organized. And the thing that I remember when we went back, we were talking about cooking, these big cooking dinner for that many people. All I can really remember is after everyone left the table, we would have dirty dishes lined up from half of the table all the way to the other end was dirty dishes. We started off with a pile of plates and silverware and the glasses and the bowls, and the end was the pots and the pans. And you washed the one side of the table so that when you started taking the dirty ones off and washing them, you had a place to put them. But really, all I can remember about a meal was all the dirty dishes that there were to wash after you were finished.
What kind of chores did the boys have? Did the girls do the inside work, the housework, and the boys do the outside work?
Well, the boys could help, like feeding the chickens and holding. Well, I had to hold the tail of the cow too when they milked the cow, because the cow wiggles its tail to get the flies off, especially in the summertime. And we all had to kind of take turns of holding that cow's tail. I didn't like that job at all. But that was usually for the smaller kids. I was glad when I got bigger and didn't have to do it anymore. But it seemed like my dad kind of could keep him busy, taking hay down from the top of the barn, pushing it down, and there were just really chores around the house. And then we had a big ditch along our house, in front of our house, and a pond across. It was not deep, it was just kind of like swampy land. And in the wintertime it would freeze. Well, then the boys would go over there and skate. And my dad still had those Holland skates that were double runners.
Okay.
And they had a good time skating together. And of course I was never able to skate. They tried to, help me, but it was just impossible. But they did have their chores too. We all had to, or it just wouldn't have worked. And then I have to tell you something that, talk about schedule. We had schedule. I told you that we ate 12 o'clock. Well, coffee's at 9 o'clock in the morning. When they were out in the field, they got their coffee and a sandwich. They came home for 12 o'clock sharp for dinner. And 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they got tea and either cake or something like that. That's why we bake so much cake. And then at 6 o'clock, we ate supper on the dot, not 5 minutes 5 minutes after. But one thing I remember very distinctly is having to polish shoes on Saturday afternoon. Everyone's Sunday shoes had to be polished on Saturday afternoon, without fail. And you only wore them once, the Sunday before, because that was Sunday clothes.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would be lined up on the basement steps, and there we would have the polish, and you had to polish his shoes. And I had one nephew that went to Calvin College, and he roomed with another boy from town. In fact, it was really John Whiffley and Sam Ventil. And so they roomed together, and the first Saturday, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, John gets his Sunday shoes out, and he gets the polish out, and Sam Ventil says to him, "What in the world are you doing, John?" John says, "Well, it's 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. It's time to polish your Sunday shoes." And so we had a lot of jokes over that, too. And we also, you have to remember, we had those old cars. Oh, I have to tell you that when we were in grade school, there were a couple of the farmers had mules. And they would always come to school unexpected on a day when the roads were covered with snow but not icy, so they never knew exactly what to take. They couldn't say, well, Thursday we're going to go for a sleigh ride. But here they would come, and they would have jingle bells on the mules, and all of us kids in the whole school
Now,
would
this
close
is
up.
Dyer School.
No, Highland Christian.
Highland Christian, okay.
It was a 4-room school. 2 classes in each room, 8 classes. And there was only like 12 in our class. And we piled into these 4 sleighs, and away we would go for a sleigh ride. And we would go past Munster Christian School, which was at that time on Ridge Road. It was a concrete block building. We'd always would stop there and say hello. And then when we got back to our school, there was one lady, Mrs. Skeringa, who always would have hot chocolate and Oli Kuchen, those Oli balls, that you deep fry with the raisins in, for us kids at the chapel. Not in school, but at the chapel. And that was the highlight of the year. I mean, from first grade on, you knew that sometime during the year, but then later on when the roads became paved and they came through with the snow plows, well, all that is past. But that was really, really a highlight of the year. Everybody, big deal. I went for a sleigh ride today.
Oh, how wonderful. What about things in the sky?
Well, that was another thing. I told you about how strict my mother and father were about being quiet while we were eating. And we were never able to leave the table until after they read the Bible and we had devotions. But there was one exception. At that time, someone invented something that would fly in the air, and they called it the airplane. And we would hear it coming, and my dad would say, "Okay, let's go out and look." So we'd all go out in the yard, and we would look for that airplane and watch it until it was out of sight. And that, I would say, is the only thing that we could be excused from the table for. Also, back in those days, they had a lot of hobos that would come knocking on your door for food, and I think they had our house marked because we had a lot of them. And my mother always was very gracious and gave them whatever we had. And one night we were sitting at the table. It was still daylight, and we were eating our supper, so it must have been supper time. And this man came, and the windows were open, and Grace went down and answered the door, the knock on the door. This man politely told my sister exactly what he wanted, what kind of a sandwich and what kind of potatoes and this and that and everything. And she was kind of flabbergasted and didn't know what to say. And my father hollered out through the open window, "Tell them there's a restaurant down at the corner." That was kind of a big joke, too, for us, because that was unusual for something like that to happen at our house. But my dad felt that if he was really hungry, he would take a sandwich or whatever we were eating. And we always had fresh milk, and most of them were very grateful for just anything.
Did Grandpa have a hard time making ends meet? I mean, he had those were single men that couldn't hold down a job. Now, Grandpa had all of those mouths to feed.
Well, he had 33 acres there of vegetable. And my father went to the market at 71st Street Market in Chicago. That's where he sold his produce. And we had one old man called Mr. Downey from Hammond, who was a very wealthy man, who wore a great big diamond man. We thought that was really the nuts in those days. And he would come and buy a whole box of asparagus every spring, without fail. And here he'd come in the yard. He says, "You've got the best asparagus around." But then one year, and I do believe it's 1932, that on July 3, my dad's crops were looking so good. I was in Englewood with my Aunt Katie. My mother and dad had company, so in those days you thought nothing of just putting a blanket on the floor and giving them a pillow, and they would sleep on the floor. And they had a hailstorm that night, and it broke the north window in the living room. And all that glass went on the person that was laying in the house. But it completely wiped out my dad's crops. It just cut the onions clear down to the ground. So my dad had nothing left but a seed bill. And he also, that year, his hair dropped out in spots on his head. And he, if you walked into church, tell where my dad was, because he would have bald, just round, bald spots. And they said that was just the anxiety, the fact that it was such a shock. And then you had the bill, and you had all these kids sitting around the table, and how were you going to make ends meet? And then the following year, then again, he planted the seed and everything, and we got a hot spell. It got over 100 for I don't know how long. We had no rain. My mother would sit on the bed and watch for the clouds, and the rain just didn't come. And so they filled up the tank that we used for water for the cow and for the horses in the pasture. And us little kids had to take cans. They put this tank on the farm truck, filled it with water, drove it in, and we had to give each tomato plant and each pepper plant a drink of water, hoping and praying that it would grow. So my dad had 2 years where he absolutely did not make one penny.
Now, they had something called the WPA in those days.
Yeah, they had all the CWA and the WPA, Civil Works and the Public Works. And those men dug ditches and did a lot of really good things. And so my dad went humbly. He didn't want to beg from the church or anything. He wanted to make it on his own. So he went, and so they gave him a job, and he was working, digging ditches and fixing roads and whatever work that they had, WPA at that time, until one of the neighbors, who was not even a citizen himself, went in and complained and told them that my father had a lot of money, and he didn't. He had a seed bill to pay and all those mouths to feed, and we would have to put cardboard in the bottom of our shoes because our soles were wore out, and it was very hard on my father that this man did that. But fortunately, there was a man in our church who, whether he inherited the money, I don't know, but without being asked, he came over one night, he and his wife, and I remember them coming, but I didn't know why they were there. But later, my mother and father told us that this man came and gave them $100, which was, that day, a lot of money because you could buy a loaf of bread for a nickel. And that put us through the winter. And then my dad could recoup, but it took a lot of years for him to recoup for the 2 years that he lost. But my sister Hilda was working at NIPSCO, and my brother Ed was driving a semi, and later on he went to welding school, and my sister was a nurse, and so they all chipped in as much money as they could so that my dad wouldn't lose the farm. And I can remember going with my mom and dad and begging the man if they could just pay the interest instead of paying anything off on the mortgage. And I have to also tell you this, that I was kind of a little sneak, I guess, as a little girl, but I remember one time they were going to go visit the neighbors next door called Kotz, which is really strange that Lois married one of their, actually it's one of their children, the youngest one, I think. But anyway, little did we know that that family would be in our relation one day, but I heard them say in Dutch that I could understand Dutch. I could talk Dutch with my dad. And they were going to go visit Kutz that night, so I went upstairs, and I remember I was too small to reach my clothes hanging up, and I got the chair, and I can remember standing on the chair and getting a clean dress. And I came downstairs all dressed up in this clean dress, and my dad says, "Where are you going?" And I says, "I want to go with you." And my mother says, "We didn't ask you." And my dad says, the Adamastaket, that meant the little darling. She got all dressed up. We can't leave her home. So they took me along to the neighbors. But then another time, there was prohibition. You couldn't buy liquor. That's why my mother made the wine. But there was a certain place, I don't know where my dad got it, but when my Aunt Katie from Inglewood would come out with it, they always ended up in the fruit cellar before they went home. So one day I thought, I'm going to see what they're doing in the fruit cellar. Well, my dad had a fruit jar in there. Give them all a little slucky. That was the little drink. "Oh, this is lekker," they said. Well, that meant that was delicious. So one night, my mom and dad were talking again, and they had to take a little ride. So I popped in the back seat of the car, lay down on the floor. They didn't know I was there. And away we go. We go. On certain lonely roads. Pretty soon my dad stops. He gets out and goes down in the ditch. And there he's getting the bootleg liquor. Well, then pretty soon we get home. There's Pearl in the back seat. I got scolded. I got scolded for that. And needless to say, told not to say one word. But I look back now, and I think that was really a big joke that my dad would do that. They were not drinkers, really, but they wanted to have a little bit when they had company.
Tell me about Grandpa's mother. Beppa was her name?
Beppa, a very unusual person. She always had a maid in Holland. Remarkable woman. Her skin, when she passed away, she was almost 102. Not a wrinkle in it. But she never learned to speak English. It was always Fries. And when my mother first dated my dad and he would take her home, my mother couldn't understand a word that she was saying, but later on my mother caught on. But she sewed all her own clothes, lived in her own house. And finally, after my grandfather died and my grandmother was getting quite old, the house was in DeMott. They decided to move that house onto my uncle's farm so that she would be close if she needed help. And then the girls, my uncle's girls, which would be my cousins, went over there and cleaned her house, and she would go to their house for dinner at night. And every time she made a new dress, she made a new apron to match. And they all thought she should go into the Holland home in Roseland. Oh, no, 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 no. She wouldn't hear of that. She wanted to stay in her own little house. And one time Aunt Katie said, well, come to me on vacation for a week. And so she said, yeah, that sounds good. I'll do that. So Aunt Katie took her over to the Holland home, which was located in Roseland, in Chicago at that time. And when Beppa got there, and there was all these old people, and they all could talk Fries, and she could carry on a conversation with them, she was so thrilled and so happy that she says, yeah, this is a good place for me. But she still made all her own clothes. She cut them out and everything. And one time a nurse said to her when she was 90 years old, now, Mrs. Boersma, I think it's time that I cut out your dresses. If you want to sew them, fine, but I'll cut them out for you. So finally my grandmother relented and said, okay, I will let you cut them out. But she sewed all her own clothes, and she never once was in the hospital. She was not senile. She had a good mind, and like the doctor at Mayo Clinic told me, he says, well, I guess you're going to live to be 100 years old, Pearl. And I says, well, how did you know my grandmother was over 100 when she died? He says, oh, was she? And I said, yes. He says, well, you've got the genes, Pearl. So hopefully, the Lord willing,
That's
live
right. That's right.
live a long life.
How old was she when she came to this country? Do we have any idea? You know, she was sending her son.
No, she was quite old, you see, because my grandfather had retired from the FBI, or whatever they called it, secret police or something in Holland. But when they moved to the United States, he still got his pension check from Holland. And my grandma got it till the day she died. She got a pension check from Holland.
Wonderful.
And then I was going to tell you about the why Aunt Gert never had any children.
Oh, yeah.
And she was a nurse, and she had this young girl. And I knew the girl because Don gave me a ticket to California as a surprise one Christmas. And I flew out there and spent 2 weeks with them. And I met the girl. Well, she became pregnant, and she had this baby, and she couldn't afford the baby. So she asked my sister, or she told my sister, I guess, that she was going to have to get rid of the baby and put it up for adoption. And my sister said, well, I would like to have the baby. So they had this baby from baby. And, they were so pleased with it, so happy with it. I don't remember what the baby's name was. I do have pictures of it, and when I find them, Sherry, I will show them to you. And they had this baby, and I have a picture of my sister teaching it to walk. That's how young the baby was. And one day when the baby was very young, 1.5 or 2 years old, the doorbell rang. It was this girl. And there was an older woman with her. And she said, my grandmother wants the baby. Well, they were devastated. But after all, it was this girl's child, but they still wonder whether it was somebody other than the grandmother that was paying this girl, more or less, that she sold the baby. And so that broke their heart, and they never again tried to adopt a baby or anything.
Oh,
But
how tragic. How many months did they have that baby?
they must have had at least 1.5 years, maybe 2 years. And somewhere I have pictures, Sherry, of it. It was a darling, and Gert was so thrilled as a little girl, and she had the darlingest clothes on, and they were devastated.
Yeah, that would certainly not make you want to adopt again.
No.
What about scarlet fever?
Oh, that was a big joke. Martha hung around with Grace Vinsman, And at those days, we had a picnic at Wicker Park. Uh, the Munster Church, or actually I guess you'd call it Munster School and Highland School, and they did it to make money all together. Everybody worked together. You know, they had a committee of men, and they would take beef to Wonder Baker, and they would wrap it in bread dough, and they would bake it for the hot beef sandwiches. And they had the best hot dogs. They had absolutely the best hot dogs. They had a wash boil. You know what a wash boiler is?
Mm-mm.
It was a copper thing that they boiled the clothes in.
Oh, okay.
Okay, they filled that with water, and in went the hot dogs, and those hot dogs were the best. Well, anyway, a few days after 4th of July, Grace Rinsmer breaks out with scarlet fever, which in those days was a dreadful disease. They put the sign up on the door, and you couldn't leave or enter the house for 6 weeks. Well, lo and behold, it didn't take long till Martha gets a rash. Sure enough, she's got scarlet fever. Now what do we do? Crops are in. This is in the end of July. My dad has to harvest the crops. He has to take them to the market. So my sister was working at Northern Indiana Public Service. She went and lived in with my sister Ann so she could take the bus to work. And it was all hush hush. Don't you dare tell anybody that Martha has scarlet fever. She was up in the bedroom. We weren't allowed to go in that room, and she had to stay up there. And my dad didn't tell anybody, but he still went to the market to sell his produce to keep us alive, you know. And one day, after I'd been outside, they decided that since I was playing with John, and I wasn't playing with Martha, and I was climbing trees like he was, that I better start wearing jeans. So my sister and her boyfriend, Stars, came one time, and they said, "What in the world are you doing in jeans?" I said, "Well, they decided I became a tomboy for the summer, so I'm allowed to wear jeans this summer." But one time, after I had finished working, I had to get all cleaned up, and I had my one dress, and you didn't change dresses every day in those days with all those kids, and you didn't have that many clothes. And so I had to go upstairs, but I wasn't allowed to go in Martha's room. I had to stay out. So I took my dress and I just flung it, and it went right in the middle of Martha's room. And I thought, oh, what am I going to do? I don't dare tell Ma, because, you know, I knew better. I should have carried it up. So I quick went up the steps, and I quick went in the room and looked at her, kind of waved at her, grabbed my dress, and I ran. And it was really so silly because I'm sure the whole house was full of germs. But after the 6 weeks period, when they came and took the sign down, they fumigated the whole house. I mean, the county came and did this. They fumigated the house to kill all the germs. I mean, things were so different in those days.
Yeah. Do you have any other memories of my dad?
Oh, I have a lot of wonderful memories of your dad. He was something special. He was a very kind man. Very kind. I remember him when he had the meat market. He'd stop over and bring us a lot of meat when we lived on Garfield Street, and he would always, like when we got married, man, he was so generous with. He was not married then. He was working, and he was so generous with his gift, and anything that we wanted, why he was always there, and he would stop over unexpectedly and help us maybe put up the Christmas tree or something. And when we were first married, of course, Don couldn't get a job because he was 1A. Then they would go sledding down the New York Central Hill. And they had a dog named Ted, and they had Ted pull the sled. And John and Don would go sledding. Those big guys would go sledding down the hill. But if you ask Don, you just tell him what a kind person he was. He was. That's probably why the Lord took him.
But growing up, he was just your little brother, or was he your older brother?
Well, he was
He's
my
your little brother.
He was younger.
2
See,
years. 2 years.
There were 3 boys below me.
Okay.
John, George, and Wes. That's why we call them the 3 little boys.
Okay.
They were younger than I was.
Okay. They didn't tease their older sister Pearl too much?
Not John.
Okay.
No, not John. John was very gentle and generous, like I said. And Don always says he was the best one in the whole family. Really, he does, and I think he was. He was so honest and kind. It's just well, he liked to play rook. He was real good at it too. And he never quibbled. If he lost, they'd say, "Well, you cheated" or something. Not him. He lost. He took it like a gentleman. And he was kind to all the little nieces and nephews, and there was a lot of them running around. And he was especially close to my son, Don Carl. Don was a baby, and when he came home from service, Don Carl must have been about 2.5. I have a picture of him with John taken in the pasture with me, and then he was, I forget which division he was in. 1st Division, 1st Battalion or something. I forget which division he was in, but anyway, he gave Don Carl one of his emblems, I guess you call them, don't you? Insignias or something.
One of the patches. that was
A
on his
patch,
shirt.
yeah, to sew on his sleeve. And Don Carl happened to have some coveralls that were army colored. And he had one sewed on his sleeve. And he still, to this day, has that patch in his drawer. And getting back to Don Carl in those khaki-colored, that was the color in those days, little coveralls, he and Bob Vanderwater, he was a little boy that lived across the street, and there was farm land, and there was corn. One day I called them for lunch, and I couldn't find those kids. I couldn't find them anywhere. The corn kind of hid the color. And I would go one row, and they would be in the next row. And I kind of lost them. But then they weren't lost. I was calling them and trying to find them. But it was funny. He had that little insignia on his, that patch on his arm, and he treasures that. And then when he went to service himself, and he was in the 1st Division, he says, Dad, he says, I think that's the same division that Uncle John was in.
Oh, my.
So that would be interesting. I'll have to ask Don Carl about that when I see him again.
Yeah.
We don't see him that often, but he's got it with all his other stuff that I kept from him when he was in Vietnam.
And you've had a tough life. Can you tell me what it was like with the polio? You got it when you were so young. You must not remember being sick much, do you?
Well, I don't remember being sick, and I really wouldn't say I had a tough life because I just didn't let it bother me. But one of the things I remember that always embarrassed me was the fact that I had to wear high-top shoes. My mother insisted I had to have high-top shoes, came over that ankle. And then whenever there was a class outing, my mother would never let me go because it would be too much walking. And I never could quite figure that out. If I could walk up and down the asparagus patch every morning to cut asparagus, why couldn't I go to the dunes? And I can remember on 4th of July talking about these picnics. Then she would say, now don't walk too much. And I can remember coming home, and that foot would be so swollen they couldn't get my shoe off. So they'd have to soak it in the water and stuff. But there was nothing the doctor could do for me when I had it. I was only 6 weeks old. My mother noticed I wasn't kicking that leg. And some lady, Mrs. Van from our church, made a special trip over to our house and told my mother, now you pat that leg hard so many times a day to keep that circulation going, or that leg's going to just go limp. And my mother would do it. Of course, I would cry because I was a baby and I was being hit. And pretty soon their older girls told me that my mother was crying too because I was crying. So it must have been hard for her, but I survived. And then in high school, I refused to wear those shoes. So then we went to Minus's, and I wore these Girl Scout shoes. And there was a man from our church that worked there, and he said, "No, Mrs. Borsman, there's no reason why Pearl can't wear these shoes instead of the Girl Scout shoes that came over the ankle." Can you imagine me going to high school with those kind of shoes on?
Now they're back in fashion.
Yeah, now they're back in fashion, but not fashion.
It's too late.
But between my, at the end of my freshman year, why, at those days, they had a Lake County doctor and a Lake County nurse that visited the schools periodically and checked everybody. You got your vaccinations and shots and stuff like that through them at that time. And this one nurse, Mrs. Sayers, was just kind of concerned about me, that here I was in high school and I had this dropped foot and everything, and so she investigated into getting something taken care of. So she talked to me at school one day about having surgery, and so she said, "You have to have it before you're age 15, and a certain organization would pay for it, otherwise we would have to pay, my dad would have to pay for it." And so she knew I had a sister that was a nurse. She was in charge of the TB sanitarium in Crown Point. So she went to visit her because she knew that my parents were elderly and also a little maybe stubborn when it came to doing anything that drastic. And so she told my sister, and my sister felt it was the right thing to do. So then my sister and this Mrs. Sayers came and told my mom and dad. And they were really not that happy about me going through with that surgery because they didn't think it would do any good. But anyway, I got excused from exams, which was one good thing that year. I didn't have to take exams at the end of the year. So I had to get down to Epworth Hospital, which is a Lutheran hospital down in South Bend, Indiana. And to get there, you had to take Route 6, which was a 2-lane highway. And it was a long trip in those days. The cars weren't like they are today. And my sister, Gert the nurse, and my mom took me down. And they stayed overnight in a hotel or motel or whatever they had in those days. And the next morning I had surgery. And I remember coming out of surgery and smelling that ether, and boy, does that ever make you sick to your stomach. And I was in an awful lot of pain, but anyway, then my mom and sister went home. And I was in South Bend for 2 weeks at that hospital all by myself. But the nurses were real kind, and I had 2 other girls in the room with me. And we kind of had a ball. And one day the nurses took us all up on top to the sun deck, which was nice. But it was very frightening to have your leg in a cast, and it was very painful. And the man came one day, and he wheeled me down into the basement and had an electric saw or a regular saw or something, and he's sawing on that leg, taking that cast off, and I'm scared silly and like being in a dungeon. And they just had to replace the bandages and put another cast on, and then for at least a year, I went back every week to South Bend. And then up until the day I got married, I went once a month. And I had certain exercises that I had to do every morning, which I did very faithfully. When they added the bathroom onto our house, they also put a basement under it. And there was a step, I would say about 4 inches high. And I would have to put my feet on the high part and my heels on the lower one and lift myself up to try to stretch that ligament in the back of my leg. See, they lengthened that as much as they could, and they pulled up because it was flat, so they pulled that all up here. They transplanted muscles.
Oh my.
I have 4 scars here. I never could move my toes before, and now I can wiggle them a little bit, but I never could move my toes before.
Did it make walking easier after that operation?
It made walking easier, but I had to learn to walk all over again because my foot had been reshaped, you see. So any old shoe wouldn't work because all my old shoes, the front part of it would go this way. So after the surgery, my foot was like this. So I had to get the shoes, and I had to literally learn to walk all over again. Then I had to do these exercises every day. And so, because when they took my leg off, the cast off, my foot just dropped, you know, from being in the cast, well, plus being paralyzed. So there was certain exercises I had to do. They had to lift up this foot, and then I had to push on it. Well, my mother decided that Martha's the one that should do that. I had to lay on the dining room table, and then she had to go through that particular exercise, and there were other ones I had to do. Well, the first time she does it, she faints away, flat on the floor. So we thought, well, this isn't going to work, because Grace wasn't married yet. But, so anyway, then what happened is I went to my sister Hilda's. She was married and she lived in Hammond. And I stayed there for quite a while for her to go through the exercises, because she was there at the clinic where they showed me what I had to do. And I was on crutches for all summer I was on crutches. And I would just slide down the steps like my dad, except I didn't fall. And then I would walk with the crutches. But it was kind of hard because you're at an age where you really want to be doing something, and here you are tied up with your leg in a cast. And then when school started, I really couldn't really walk very well. And I would stand outside and watch for the bus coming over the railroad crossing in New York Central there on Main Street. And when I saw him stop,